you might find yourself a little dismayed by the clamor outside these walls, the name calling, the negative ads, the folks yelling at each other on TV. After being surrounded by people who are so dedicated to serving others and making the world a better place, you might feel a little discouraged by the polarization and gridlock that too often characterize our politics and civic life. And in the face of all that clamor, you might have an overwhelming instinct to just run the other way as fast as you can. You might be tempted to just recreate what you had here at Oberlin, to find a community of like-minded folks and work with them on causes you care about, and just tune out all of the noise. And that's completely understandable. In fact, I sometimes have that instinct myself. Run! But today, graduates, I want to urge you to do just the opposite. Today, I want to suggest that if you truly wish to carry on the Oberlin legacy of service and social justice, then you need to run to and not away from the noise. Today, I want to urge you to actively seek out the most contentious, polarized, gridlock places you can find. Because so often throughout our history, those have been the places where progress really happens. The places where minds are changed, lives transformed, where our great American story unfolds. For example, think back to the struggle for women's suffrage and the story of a leading suffragist and Oberlin alum named Lucy Stone. Yeah, people screamed at her. They spat on her. They even threw prayer books at her as she tried to speak. Her opponents declared that letting women vote was, quote unquote, unnatural, would lead to child neglect and all kinds of social ills. So I'd say that debate was pretty polarized, wouldn't you? Yeah. And think about President Roosevelt's struggle to pass the New Deal a few decades later. FDR's plan for Social Security was called socialist, a fraud on the working man. One opponent even stated that it would, quote, end the progress of a great country, unquote. So that debate was pretty contentious too. And in the years before Dr. King addressed those Oberlin graduates in '65, he and his colleagues faced fire hoses and dogs in Montgomery, beatings on a bridge in Selma, insults and assaults as they sat quietly at lunch counters and marched peacefully down public streets. And if you think today's gridlock is bad, let me remind you that it was a good century between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the passage of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. And of all the women at the Seneca Falls Women's Suffrage Convention in 1848, just one lived to see women cast their votes. Just one. But these folks didn't let the ugliness and the obstacles deter them. They didn't just give up and retreat to the comfortable company of like-minded folks, because they understood that this is how democracy operates. It is loud and messy, and it's not particularly warm and fuzzy. And believe me, I know this from personal experience. Over the years, I've occasionally run into the noise myself, but I've come to realize that most of that clamor is really coming from just a handful of very loud folks out on the fringes. See, the truth is that the overwhelming majority of people in this country are open-minded and big-hearted. They are smart enough to see through that noise, and they are so hungry for voices that rise above it. Smart, compassionate, thoughtful voices like yours. Now, the process of democracy might not always be as fast or as smooth as we'd like, but the fact is it works. Generation after generation, this country has become more equal, more inclusive, more fair, more free. My life and so many of your lives are a testament of that truth. But that has only happened because folks like all of you left their comfort zones and made their voices heard. You see, it's wonderful to volunteer at your local homeless shelter. Please do that. But you also need to attend the city council meetings and make sure the zoning laws don't shut that shelter down. Are you thinking of teaching in an underserved school? If so, I'm glad to hear that. So many kids need you. But you've also got to elect good people to your school board and state legislature because they decide whether you have the resources you need to inspire and empower your students. Are you planning to rally for marriage equality on the steps of the Supreme Court? I certainly hope so. But I also hope you will knock on doors and make some calls to elect a president who shares your values, because that president will ultimately choose the justices who decide those cases in the first place. And finally, while peaceful protests can be powerful, if we truly want to reform our criminal justice system, then we need to come together and do the hard work of changing our laws and policies to reflect our values. Now, will this be easy? No, of course not. It will be hard. It will be stressful and frustrating, and you'll probably have to make some painful compromises along the way. After all, Lucy Stone spent years speaking out for partial suffrage, for allowing women to vote only on things like school issues and local issues, because she realized that full suffrage was just too controversial. And FDR, well, after facing all kinds of opposition, he eventually agreed to a Social Security plan that covered only 60% of workers. Was he thrilled about that? Probably not. But in the end, FDR realized that 60% was a whole lot better than 0%. Now, did these compromises make these leaders sellouts, traitors to their cause? I don't think so. Instead, I think they knew that if they could just get everyone to take that first step, then folks would keep on moving in the right direction. And they also understood that often the biggest, most dramatic change happens incrementally, little by little, through compromises and adjustments over years and decades. And I know that these days that can seem counterintuitive because we live in such an instantaneous age. We want everything right away, whether it's an Uber or your favorite TV show, and we want it tailored to our exact preferences and beliefs. We fill our Twitter feed with voices that confirm rather than challenge our views. If we dislike someone's Facebook post, we just unfollow them, we unfriend them. And even here at Oberlin, most of the time you're probably surrounded by folks who share your beliefs. But out in the real world, there are plenty of people who think very differently than you do. And they hold their opinions just as passionately. So if you want to change their minds, if you want to work with them to move this country forward, you can't just shut them out. You have to persuade them, and you have to compromise with them. That is what so many of our heroes of history have done. Folks like Lucy Stone and FDR, they didn't get caught up in their egos or their ideology. They didn't say it's my way or the highway. Instead, they knew where they wanted to go, and they were strategic and pragmatic about getting there. Because in the end, they understood, as the political scientist Joseph Nye once said, that, quote, the absolutist may avoid the problem of dirty hands, but often at the cost of having no hands at all, unquote. And graduates, with a degree from this amazing school and all the status and connections that degree confers, you don't get to have no hands. No, you don't get to be precious or cautious or cynical. No, not when the earth is warming and the oceans are rising. You don't get to be cynical. Not when too many young people still languish in communities ripped apart by violence and despair. Not when women still make less than men for the same work. Not when millions of girls across the globe never set foot inside a school. No, not when many young people just like you, the men and women we honor this Memorial Day, have sacrificed their lives for your freedom to make your voice heard. You don't get to have no hands. You see, in his speech to those Oberlin graduates 50 years ago, Dr. King urged them, as Julia said, not to sleep through the civil rights revolution that was raging across this country. And graduates, climate change, economic inequality, human rights, criminal justice, these are the revolutions of your time. And you have as much responsibility and just as much power to wake up and play your part in our great American story, because it is absolutely still possible to make a difference. The great moments of our history are not decades in our past. They're happening right now, today, in our lifetimes. Just think about the folks who are winning those battles state by state, city by city, to ensure that everyone in this country can marry the person they love. Think about how just 10 years ago, gay marriage was legal in just one state in this country, just one. And today it is legal in 37 states and Washington, D.C. Think about those elections in 2008 and 2012, when idealistic young people like all of you worked long hours for little money and less sleep, pounding the pavement for months, talking to folks about what was at stake. Think about the millions of folks who got out to vote on Election Day, waiting in the cold and rain and lines that stretched for hours, refusing to leave until they made their voices heard. And finally, think about how even with all the gridlock and polarization in Washington, we have made so much change these past 6 years. 12 million new jobs, 16 million people who finally have health insurance, historic agreements to fight climate change, epic increases in college financial aid, more progress on LGBT rights than any time in our history. And today, it is no longer remarkable to see two beautiful black girls walking their dogs on the south lawn of the White House. That's just the way things are now. See, graduates, this is what happens when you turn your attention outward and decide to brave the noise and engage yourself in the struggles of our time. And that's why in his remarks 50 years ago, Dr. King urged the class of '65 to stand up and be a concerned generation. And graduates, that call to action applies just as much to all of you today. And I want to be very clear. Every city ordinance, every ballot measure, every law on the books in this country, that is your concern. What happens at every school board meeting, every legislative session, that is your concern. Every elected official who represents you, from dog catcher to president of the United States, they are your concern. So get out there and volunteer on campaigns, and then hold the folks you elect accountable. Follow what's happening in your city hall, your state house in Washington, D.C. Better yet, Run for office yourself. Get in there. Shake things up. Don't be afraid. And get out and vote in every election. Not just the big national ones that get all the attention, but every single election. Make sure the folks who represent you share your values and aspirations. See, that is how you will rise above the noise and shape the revolutions of your time. That is how you will have a meaningful journey on those clamorous highways of life.